We challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samueli. It is now 9:08 p.m. in the dark, gloomy, dismal Budapest, where the fall is definitely here. The weather's quite chilly. I've got all the awful fall allergies. Days are getting increasingly almost laughably short. You have to turn the light on middle of the afternoon, and so the miserable fall winter and fall winter here is pretty dismal. Is almost upon us. However, on this, I see Ahmadovich says George is late. He's still sleeping on this cold night. Yes, yes. Fashionably late. That should be the appropriate term. So anyway, thank you very much, everybody who has joined me. It is now time for the Tuesday live stream, and there's a few things to talk about. But before we get on to that, so our good friend Peter Kovic says, George, do you think the West's hatred for Russia might have something to do with that they have never renounced their Soviet legacy, unlike other Eastern European countries? I do think that has something to do with it. It's a very interesting question. I remember some years ago taking part in crosstalk, and the subject of the discussion was Russophobia. It was a long time ago. It had to have been, well, I guess maybe 10 years ago. About 10 years ago, and I was on with Alexander Nekrasov. I don't know if you remember him. He died a few years back. He was a kind of a veteran Russian correspondent. He'd lived in London really since Soviet times, so his English was perfect. He used to go on all the various shows on BBC and everything else, and so that was the question. Russophobia. What is the origin of Russophobia? And Nekrasov argued, well, that's because Russia is seen to be the embodiment of conservatism. So, as I say, this was a long time ago. So this was before, obviously before Ukraine, before the Skripals, and obviously before Russiagate. So it was really before the most recent hysteria. And so Nekrasov, as I say, said, oh, well, it's because Russia is the embodiment of conservatism, that it espouses conservative values. It espouses the values of morality, tradition, family, having children. And of course, it's gone out of its way to restore the Russian Orthodox Church, which had been persecuted by the Bolsheviks. And so somehow, because the contemporary liberal West is unable to cope with this with this embodiment of conservatism, as it's too much of a challenge to its liberal preconceptions. It's driven by a liberal ideology, and therefore Russia is throwing down the gauntlet to this liberal hegemony. And that, I thought that was not a bad argument, but I argued something differently, and I argued something along the lines that Peter Kovic just argued, that Russia has never really renounced its Soviet legacy. I mean, obviously, it's no longer identifies itself as communist. It's doesn't pursue socialist economic policies in any sense at all, and so there, therefore it's um, a, the what one would call a a contemporary part of the contemporary liberal world. And I didn't address so much the conservative issue, but I did say that what is striking is that they have not renounced the Soviet legacy. And that Soviet legacy is the great education system. You have to, they accepted that the Soviet Union did build up an amazing education system. And even, somebody, like my father, um, who had been through the Soviet education system, and he was as anti-Soviet and as anti-communist as you can imagine. Said that was an amazing education system. I mean, they really, it was a very, it was almost like a kind of Dickensian, model of education, a kind of grad grind. They banged facts into you. They forced you to study poetry. They forced you to study history, geography, whatever, everything. They actually, really made you learn, as opposed to the kind of Western lackadaisical system, in which people really went through the education system knowing very little. I went through the British education system, and I was kind of amazed how little I learned during my years there. I mean, it was obviously partly my fault, but also, the education system was fairly lackadaisical, because they tried to move away from that model that you go to school and then you have to, learn and memorize and so on. So they thought, well, no, we don't want to do that. And so, I mean, all kinds of things that, even ended even before I started in school. So, for instance, it used to be the practice in, say, the British education system that you were supposed to memorize poetry. And I can't say that I particularly would have enjoyed, and I did do a little bit of that, but I can't say I enjoyed doing it. But it was a good training for memory, and I think as memory training goes, it's not a bad one, to memorize poetry and memorize huge chunks of Shakespeare. And so, but that pretty much ended even before I started in the education system. And for instance, learning handwriting. That also used to be part of any the British education system. You learned to write, and that, of course, is very, very useful, because if you learn handwriting, that enables you, when you go somewhere, particularly when you go to university, it enables you to take notes. But you have to take notes, and you have to do them very quickly. And if you don't know how to write, you don't know how to join your letters, then it takes a long time, because you have to keep lifting up your hand. Um, and so the learning how to write, how to join up your letters, was actually quite a useful exercise. But that ended in under the British education system, but they retained it in the Soviet education system. Now, so that was one, that along with that, the Soviet education system was part of the Soviet legacy, and Russia is still espouses that. Then there's, of course, the great victory in World War II, the Great Patriotic War. It was, they took on the Wehrmacht, and was pretty much the first power that was able to crush the Wehrmacht. In fact, it's very, very doubtful whether the British or the Americans would ever have been able to defeat the Wehrmacht. By the time they actually took on the Wehrmacht seriously after the D-Day landings, I mean, the Wehrmacht was just simply a shadow of the force that it once was, and they were just completely overwhelmed by British and American air power and artillery and all military hardware. So they weren't able to fight. But but before their defeat at the hands of the Red Army, the Wehrmacht just really just beat beat the British and the Americans like a drum. Every time the British and the Americans fought the Wehrmacht won easily. So it was really the Red Army was really the first and only power that was able to defeat the Wehrmacht. So that's another source of pride in the Soviet Union. And then, of course, there was the space program, and it was the Soviet Union that really launched the space program. They were the first to put the Sputnik up in the air. They were the first to put a man into space, and then, of course, they built the space station. So, these are all sources of pride in the Soviet Union. Now, the reason why it's worth pointing that out is that if you go back to the era of, say, 1988, something like 88 through to about 2000, pretty much everyone who spoke on behalf of the Soviet Union was denouncing every aspect of the Soviet legacy. So there was, it wasn't just the terror, it wasn't just the collectivization, it was just everything. Everything the Soviets touched failed. Their foreign policy failed, their industry failed, their education system failed, space program failed. Everything was superior by the West, and the Putin's Russia really turned its back on that, and said, well, we can't really denounce all of the Soviet legacy. Some of the Soviet legacy, in fact, quite a lot of the Soviet legacy, is something that we can be proud of. And I quite agree with you, Peter, that does irk the West, because pretty much everybody in the Eastern Europe has renounced the communist era. Now, to be fair, in Eastern Europe, it was a little different because the communism really didn't emerge organically anywhere in Eastern Europe. It was always imposed from the outside, and so there wasn't really any. So when they thought about communism, they thought this is something that we wouldn't have come to naturally. It came via the Red Army, including, what should I say, including Yugoslavia. So again, no Red Army, then no communist rule in Yugoslavia. Whatever Tito and the partisans accomplished in Yugoslavia, they wouldn't have come to power had it not been for the Red Army. It was the Red Army that liberated Yugoslavia. But but I think the point, I think, is an important one, that Russia has refused to renounce that Soviet legacy, and I think that is a serious problem, and I think that's a more important issue. I mean, the conservatism question, whether that's anathema to modern liberalism, and that's why liberals hate Russia. I think that does play a role, but I don't think in itself would be quite so salient as the fact that somehow Russia has not renounced the Soviet Union. And when Lavrov, he said this the other day when he was interviewed by Kristen Walker. I never know whether she's Kristen or Kirsten. I'm always confused about that. But anyway, I'll call her Kristen today. Usually I call her Kirsten. Anyway, Kristen Walker asked him about why was he wearing a sweatshirt with the USSR written on it. And he did say that, well, Putin and I grew up in the USSR, and so we do feel nostalgic about the USSR, and then I think she asked him, so does Putin, or Putin, I should say Putin, does Putin want to restore the USSR? I said, no, no, no. It's like, as Putin has said many times, anyone who doesn't feel nostalgic about the USSR has no heart. Anyone who wants to restore the USSR has no head. Um, and I think that's the case. They know that ship has sailed, and that the USSR cannot be restored. And that, I think, is segues to a point that I want to talk about, because we touched on this during the live stream with Peter on yesterday, which is that what are Russia's obligations um, in recognizing the independence of the former republics of the USSR? Because um, the important thing was that back in 1990, in the spring of 1990, the Congress of People's Deputies um, passed legislation that had been proposed by Gorbachev himself on the secession, of the republics from the USSR. And so this legislation outlined the steps that each republic would have to take in order to secede from the USSR. And it was a complicated procedure, because under the Soviet constitution it declared that, every republic has the right to secede, but the constitution didn't spell out, well, what steps do you take in order to secede? Because basically, when they drafted all of the constitutions, but the most recent one, which is the one that was operative in 1990, which was the 1978, the Brezhnev Constitution, that didn't spell out, none of the constitutions. The Stalin Constitution of 1936 didn't spell out the procedure of how to secede, and it was just assumed, reasonably enough, that as long as the Communist Party was in control, then no republic would secede, because the Communist Party would make sure that the Union stayed intact. So by 1990, this was no longer a done deal. So Gorbachev proposed this legislation in order to make secession as difficult as possible. I see a question here from Amanda. It says, "What's your favorite Russian author, George?" I have to say, I mean, and I have to be totally unoriginal about it. I have to say it is Dostoevsky. It has to be Dostoevsky. I think almost all of the works that I read of his. I haven't read all of them, but the ones that I've read are all amazing novels. They're the most extraordinary works of genius. Um, and in a way, they always, in my case, I mean, those novels haunt me. I mean, it's like, I read them years ago now, and and I'm nearly always thinking about them. So there's rarely a day goes by when there's some event from a Dostoevsky novel that doesn't come to mind. I'm always thinking about Crime and Punishment. I mean, it's like it's such a rich novel, and the characters are so richly drawn, and the psychology and the drama is so vivid that it just kind of haunts you. The same goes with the devils or the possessed. They carry. Sometimes it's called in Russian it was besi, but it's translated as the devil sometimes, or the devils or the possessed. Again, it always haunts me, as does The Idiot, which is a very different novel of Dostoevsky, but nonetheless, really worth reading. So, always. So, I mean, it's not a very original choice because many people regard him as one of the greatest writers ever. So, I'm hardly breaking any new ground there. But since I was asked, I have to say it. But anyway, just going back to 1990. So the Gorbachev legislation said, okay, well, you have to hold a referendum, um, and once you hold a referendum on independence, you have to gain 2/3 of the registered voters, not 2/3 of the people who voted, 2/3 of the registered voters. So that's quite a tall order that you've got to get that. Then, when you've secured 2/3 of the registered voters, you have to make your application to the Supreme Soviet of the USSR. And that's going to there's a 5-year cooling off period. So therefore, in order to discuss with the Supreme Soviet all issues about borders, issues about how debt would be distributed between the federal government and now the new independent state, and the minorities within each of the republics would also have to hold referendums, and they too will get to decide whether they want to secede, because secession cannot be forced on anyone. So if each, when you looked at the map of the USSR, each of the republics had their own individual, either their own individual republics, or they had their own individual oblasts, and so they would all get to decide whether they wanted to leave the USSR or to stay. And so nobody can be forced to leave the USSR, and so Amanda says, "Thank you, George. Anton Chekhov is mine. Good writer, no question. Very, very good writer. I have to say, though, that I do find him depressing. Great, absolutely great dramatist. But you don't. You come away from one of his plays, and I mean, if you're not if you're not the most cheerful person already, you're going to be feeling really, really down afterwards. So, the older I get, the more I try to avoid any kind of literary works that are going to depress me. So, I'll leave it at that. But I don't dispute his genius. But anyway, so they brought this high bar that this is the process that you have to go through in order to secede. So it was going to be difficult, very difficult to secede under the Gorbachev legislation. But that did become the legislation of the USSR, the Congress of the People's Deputies. Now, what then happened? So that's the spring of 1990. Then in March 1991, the following also legislation by the Congress of People's Deputies, they hold a referendum, a binding referendum. So it's going to be binding. A Soviet-wide referendum on whether the people want to maintain a union similar to the USSR. Obviously, it's not going to be a communist union, but nonetheless, it'll be kind of a union of sovereign states or something along those lines. March 1991, something like they hold the referendum, binding referendum. 80% vote for the maintenance of of a union. So now you've got that, which is again binding, and then you've got the issue of the legislation on the secession. Now, what happens then? Gorbachev undertakes these negotiations with the republics on the terms of this union of sovereign states, and so he's negotiating there, and all the states, I think, take part with the exception of the Baltic republics and Georgia. So he's conducting these negotiations, and then, so in the meantime, all of the republics had made these declarations for on this, the state sovereignty. So they all make these declarations. It's this fairly pointless, meaningless declaration. Well, you have state sovereignty, including, of course, Russia made its declaration of state sovereignty. Ukraine made this declaration of state sovereignty. And it was in that declaration of state sovereignty that Ukraine said that it had the intention of being a neutral state. Now, it was always a little difficult to understand what Ukraine meant by that, because at that moment when it issued that declaration, I think it was July 1990, Ukraine was within the Soviet Union. It was the Soviet Republic of Ukraine, and so it hard to see how, as long as it was in the USSR, how it could be neutral. Now, you could absolutely interpret it as meaning that Ukraine intended to secede. That's why it talked about neutrality. I mean, how can it be neutral if it is part of the USSR? So when they issued that Declaration of State Sovereignty, it was doubtless they already intended to secede from USSR. But even if that's the case, that they always intended to secede, it is that their intention was they would secede, but they would nonetheless be neutral. They would not form any military alliance, and they would not allow foreign forces to be stationed on Ukrainian territory. So anyway, so then we have so Gorbachev's negotiating this new union with these republics, with the exception of the Baltics and Georgia, and then we have the coup, and that the coup of August 1991, that really spurred the opportunists to make their move to secede, and so now, by the time Gorbachev returns, Gorbachev resumes negotiations on this new union of sovereign states, but a number of the republics are now no longer taking part in these negotiations. So I think it's only now down to 9 republics who are still in negotiations with Gorbachev. And then, of course, you have the meeting at Belovej between Russia, led by Yeltsin, and then Ukraine, led by Kravchuk, and then the guy who led Belarus. And then they just simply decided there in the forest of Belovej to dissolve the USSR. So that action of dissolving the USSR obviously had no basis whatsoever in the USSR Constitution, which, as I said, all that the USSR Constitution had said was that republics can secede, without spelling out how that was to be accomplished. Then Gorbachev passes legislation, spring of 1990, spelling out the steps that republics have to go through. Quite a a high hurdle, and as is entirely proper. Secession is a very big deal. It's a big deal for the seceding republic, and of course, it's a big deal for the core state that would be left behind. So it should be difficult to secede. So, but that was spelled out, um, and then you have the March 1991 referendum, a binding referendum. It was not a referendum, of a la carte. You can either accept it or you don't accept it. It was the legislation said that the legislation that enabled this referendum to take place. The legislation said this would be a binding referendum, so everyone would have to accept the results. So the people who took part in that referendum knew that everybody would have to accept the results of that referendum. 80% vote to maintain the a union of sovereign states as a successor state to the USSR. And then you have Belovesh and the dissolution, the illegal, unconstitutional dissolution of the USSR. And so the USSR is no more. And so then we have, after that, the republics. So these are the republics who had up until then, they had not seceded. Most of the republics of the USSR had not seceded. They were still negotiating with Gorbachev for a new union treaty. But once Yeltsin had dissolved the USSR, and Gorbachev was left, with an office that basically, represented nothing, because there was no longer a USSR. He was the president of the USSR. There was no USSR. Then everybody else, bolted for the exits. And so, but what it means is that Ukraine's secession, Ukraine's declaration of independence, is wholly devoid of any legal standing. Now, Ukraine did declare independence on August the 24th, 1991, but that had no legal standing. The Declaration of State Sovereignty had, I guess, some legal standing in that at least it was accepted by the other republics, but nothing drastic had taken place. I mean, you can just declare that you're sovereign. It doesn't really mean that much. Anyone can declare anything. But the secession was certainly not accepted by the Soviet government and was not accepted by anyone else. So they did this August of 24th, just a few days after the coup that ousted Gorbachev. So they pounced, the slimy opportunists that they are. They pounced in the aftermath of the coup against Gorbachev. But it had no legal standing, and because, as I said, it didn't follow any of the procedures that had been laid down under Soviet law. Well, that really means that there's no obligation on the part of anybody to recognize anything. And if you haven't followed any of the legal procedures, now, the Russians haven't made that argument. They have made the argument that Ukraine had promised in its declaration of state sovereignty that it would be neutral, and Ukraine has broken that promise. So that they made that argument. They haven't made the argument that Ukraine's entire edifice as a state is based on an illegality, that the secession was illegal. and therefore there's no obligation to recognize it. I guess the difficulty that you have in, in making that argument is that Russia subsequently did agree to recognize Ukraine's independence. I don't think they should have done. I mean, that's I think the problem. They shouldn't have done, and they should have stuck to their guns. But of course, there would need to have been a very different Russian leadership for that. And the problem for Russia is Yeltsin, because it was Yeltsin who dissolved the USSR. You know, he was the one, he blazed the trail with that Declaration of State Sovereignty, and then he goes to Belovej and dissolves the USSR. So then it becomes difficult to make the argument, well, Ukraine's actions were independent. I mean, were somehow illegal. Now, that's very different from Serbia's case. Serbia's case was, I think, much stronger because Serbia, under Milosevic, had insisted on retaining Yugoslavia. He did not secede from Yugoslavia in the way that Russia effectively seceded or dissolved the USSR. So therefore, Milosevic could argue that the secessions of Croatia and Slovenia, and it was Croatia and Slovenia really before the West intervened. So only Croatia and Slovenia had seceded. So the rest, the other republics had still remained within Yugoslavia. So you got Macedonia, Montenegro, and Bosnia and Herzegovina and Serbia still remained within Yugoslavia, but except Croatia and Slovenia. So, and that would have been, a strong legal basis for Yugoslavia to insist these are illegal secessions. They've been determined to be illegal by the 9-member Constitutional Court of Yugoslavia. 9 members. So, in other words, the 9 members represented each of the republics, and as well as the autonomous provinces of Kosovo and Vojvodina. So they said, no, these secessions are illegal. And it was then that the West intervened, and intervened very, very decisively by essentially determining that Yugoslavia this isn't secession. Yugoslavia is a state in the process of dissolution, and then they put forward a program of how to secede from Yugoslavia, and they promised that if you follow this procedure, it was a very easy procedure, we will recognize you. And that's what they did. That's what they did with this the conference, the Yugoslav conference, chaired by Lord Carrington, and they appointed the Badinter Commission, and then it was just so easy. So everyone headed for the exits, where before with the Western intervention, it could have at least been kept together because only Croatia and Slovenia had seceded, and those secessions had been declared to be illegal by the proper constitutional authorities. But even then, even when that happened, when the Badinter Commission just outlined this thing of how you can just go straight for the exit. Even then, Milosevic insisted that those republics that wanted to stay within Yugoslavia can stay in Yugoslavia and will retain the name of Yugoslavia. This was the core of Yugoslavia. And although it comprised only Serbia and Montenegro, so it was a substantial core because Serbia was the most populous republic in Yugoslavia. So unlike Russia, Serbia never seceded from Yugoslavia. And he insisted on the name. He said it was the Tito's state was called the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. But Milosevic's state has said, well, this is the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. We are the successor state to the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. So he had retained the name Yugoslavia. Now, this, the West said, you don't get to call yourself Yugoslavia. You don't get, that's it. You're not going to call yourself Yugoslavia because you are not the successor state. You are just one of the successor states. So if you want to remain a member of the United Nations, you're going to have to reapply. You're not going to retain the seat of the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. You're going to have to reapply. You're not the successor state. You are one of the successor states. So you're as much a successor state as Croatia, as Montenegro, as Macedonia, as Bosnia and Herzegovina. And Milosevic refused to do that. And for his efforts, the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia was kicked out of the United Nations. But he stuck to his guns. He stuck to the principle that the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia is the successor state of the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, and that we're going to retain the name of Yugoslavia because this is the state for those who want to remain a part of Yugoslavia. And the first thing that was done by the coup plotters, the coup that overthrew Milosevic in October 1990, the first thing they did was, you guessed it, they reapplied to the United Nations. They reapplied and said, we accept that we are not the successor state of Yugoslavia. And then right away they were given a different name. So they say, Yugoslavia, and then they put first of all, they put in parentheses Serbia and Montenegro. So Yugoslavia, Serbia, and Montenegro in parentheses. And then in no time at all, Yugoslavia just disappeared, and it was just Serbia and Montenegro. And then in no time at all, Montenegro seceded, and there was just simply Serbia. So mission accomplished. But my point is that Milosevic, unlike Yeltsin, maintained the principle that we are the successor state of the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. And that those who want to be a part of Yugoslavia are welcome to be a part of Yugoslavia. So when he did that, when Milosevic did that, he then immediately got accused, as you would expect, of trying to create a greater Serbia. But of course, he wasn't creating a greater Serbia. He said Yugoslavia. I just want to retain Yugoslavia. Those who want to be a part of Yugoslavia should be a part of Yugoslavia. And so even though it gets kicked out of the United Nations, said, no, we are Yugoslavia. And I think we should remain a home for those who want to be a part of Yugoslavia. Unlike Yeltsin, was, I don't know, we're just dissolving the USSR. Which is why I've always insisted, Milosevic was a great man, and the Russian leaders were not great men. So that's that. All right. So my point is that Russia kind of created problems for itself by the terrible leaders that it had during the 1990s. However, that doesn't mean that it shouldn't question the legality of all of the secessions. Just because Russia, under the terrible leadership that they had, didn't follow proper legal and constitutional procedures, that doesn't mean that one shouldn't raise those very issues now and say, I am sorry, but this what happened then jeopardized the rights. This was a conspiracy against the rights of 300 million people who lived within the USSR. It was a conspiracy against their rights, conspiracy against them, who wanted to remain a part of Yugoslavia. I mean, of the USSR, or a successor state, which would still be a union state. It was a conspiracy against them, and that those people were denied their right to live in that state. They were denied that right, and so therefore, given there was a conspiracy, given that there was a coup against them, then I think one should absolutely raise this issue. I mean, some people. I mean, obviously, the legality. People are going to challenge the legality of this, but I think, given the appalling consequences of that chaotic breakup of the USSR, just like the appalling consequences of the chaotic breakup of Yugoslavia, I think it is high time to raise the question of the illegality of this dissolution. And then in the case of Yugoslavia, not only is a question of the illegality of the breakup of Yugoslavia, but there you have an absolute plot, an absolute conspiracy by the Western powers to destroy Yugoslavia. So all along the way, there was clearly a plot to destroy it. When the Yugoslav conference met in the fall of 1991, Yugoslavia was more or less still intact. All that had happened was that Croatia and Slovenia had unilaterally seceded. It was unilateral. It was not recognized by the authorities of Yugoslavia, not recognized by the Constitutional Court of Yugoslavia. But the other republic, 4 republics, were still members of Yugoslavia. After this conference, the Lord Carrington's conference, after all of these pricks got involved, the Badinter Commission, which involved the the various Supreme Court justices of Western Europe. No one from Yugoslavia. The Supreme Court justices from Western Europe. Badinter himself had been head of the Constitutional Court of France, so they got themselves involved. And then, within a few months, Yugoslavia was gone. So that was. So I think these legalities should be challenged. I think it's a great shame that Russia hasn't challenged it. And then, and the other thing that I want to mention is, I don't think Russia. I mean, we talked about this with Peter yesterday, and the point I tried to make was that I don't think Lavrov makes his case particularly effectively when he keeps repeating this expression, the indivisibility of security, because I don't think people understand what that means, and it's hard to understand. I mean, those who are those of us who are following these things on a regular basis, we know what he's getting at. But most people don't know. What do you mean by indivisibility of security? I mean, it's pretty straightforward. Every country should feel secure. Fine, Ukraine should feel secure, yes, but so should Russia. What NATO has done is define security as security only for NATO or for NATO allies such as Ukraine, but others don't have security concerns. Just simply say, yeah, everyone should be entitled to security, and then that's the reason why we need to have a new Helsinki process, precisely in order to ensure that everybody has security, and that the way NATO goes on, somehow only NATO is entitled to security, is wholly wrong and destructive, and will lead to disaster. In fact, it already has led to disaster. I just don't think Gorbachev, Lavrov has made that case. He just keeps saying indivisibility of security, and I don't think people know what he's saying. So I think that's a problem. Um, and the and that brings on to the question of when he talks about this. The Istanbul process and the negotiations that took place about the guarantees for Ukraine's security. I don't think he's made the case sufficiently of saying, look, there are plenty of precedents in history in which powers guarantee the neutrality of a state. So there was the 1839 Treaty of London that guaranteed the neutrality of Belgium. There was obviously the 1955 um, treaty that guaranteed the neutrality of Austria. There was the 1962 treaty guaranteed the neutrality of Laos. And there were other cases, I mean, which were more or less successful. Cases where at least the security of Cyprus was guaranteed by a number of powers. Lebanon was guaranteed by a number of powers. So, I mean, by no means were all these cases successful. But there is a principle in which it's accepted that it's in the interests of everybody that a state remain neutral, that it does not join any military alliances, and that its security, territorial integrity, or whatnot, is guaranteed by a number of powers, and a number of powers who have adverse interests toward one another. And so I think that could have been. I think the Russians could make this case much more effective. Just cite the example of Austria. I mean, most people don't know this. I mean, this was really 70 years ago, but that was a clear successful story of the Cold War. Laos would have been successful, but I mean, it wasn't, just simply because its neutrality was not recognized. Was in theory, it was supposed to be neutral, but in practice, both the Americans and the North Vietnamese made use of Laos during the Vietnam War. And then there's the case of Belgium. Now, it lasted. I mean, it was 1839. Finally, the neutrality of Belgium was violated in 1914 by Germany, but that was 75 years later. So for 75 years, its neutrality was guaranteed. It was also the case of Switzerland. Switzerland's neutrality was also guaranteed at the Congress of Vienna. So there's a lot of lot of examples, and I think the Russians could easily make a much stronger case for what they're trying to do, and precisely to say, look, that it's been recognized many times in the past that it is not in the interest of peace and security for one set of great powers to try to wheedle somebody into their particular alliance. So that's just destabilizing. So that was clearly, it was not in the interests of the West or the Soviet Union for Austria to be aligned with one or another. So they decided that they would protect its neutrality. So Nalesini says Austria isn't neutral anymore. Well, it's a member of the EU, which, I mean, I don't know what you call that as neutral or not neutral. Well, yeah, I mean, you could probably say Ireland is sort of neutral. It's kind of a member of the EU, but it's not a member of any military alliance. I think that was really the key. Austria is not a member of NATO any more than Ireland is a member of NATO. Russia hasn't objected in principle to Ukraine's joining the EU, but now it's a little more difficult because, back in, I think, 2013, 2014, when Yanukovych was negotiating that EU associate member treaty, the Russians didn't really object in principle to Ukraine's joining the EU. I mean, the only thing that the Russians had problems with was a free trade. I mean, they said, well, if you have a free trade treaty with Russia and then you have a free trade treaty with the EU, then effectively Russia will have had signed a free trade agreement with the EU. And of course, that's would be ridiculous because essentially then the EU would wipe out Russia's industry. So Russia essentially said, we'd have to renegotiate. I mean, you can't, they said to Ukraine, you can't have a free trade treaty with us and a free trade treaty with the EU. But in principle, they weren't opposed to Ukraine's joining the EU. However, it might be a little different now because the EU and NATO have become so closely intermingled. I mean, since 2014, they've signed a number of agreements, EU-NATO agreements, that NATO is really now the armed force of the EU, which it shouldn't have become, but nonetheless it is. So I think now, I think Russia would quite legitimately reject the possibility of Ukraine joining the EU. And I think that going back to Nalazini's point, that Austria isn't neutral anymore, that, yeah, as a member of the EU, through no action of Austria, but because the EU is now so much joined at the hip with NATO, that effectively, you are now a member of NATO if you're a member of the EU. Anyway, let's take a look at some of the comments on the people on our locals board. These are the people who contribute to the upkeep of these angry dogs who feel that they're always underappreciated, undervalued, and underpaid and underfed, moreover. But anyway, thank you so much, everybody who has contributed to our locals board. And so let me take a look at some of the comments here. And first comment is from our friend Cynthia. Cynthia is our resident film expert. So as I always say, whenever I address Cynthia's comments, that you need to look at the film that we screened on Monday, and it's invariably a pretty decent film. So it's a decent film, so it's still there up on the locals board. So watch the film, and most important, read Cynthia's running commentary, because it really is fascinating. You get all sorts of amazing information about the film, the background, of how it was made, what disputes arose in the making of the film, interpretations and so on. And so it's always really, you always learn so much from reading Cynthia's comments. Anyway, so Cynthia now says, regarding last night's film, contrary to what many critics have written about it, Lucia is not a Jew at all, but the daughter of a socialist activist. Yes. In many interviews, Cavani, who is she wrote the film and she directed the film, Liliana Cavani, explicitly underscored the universal dimension of Lucia's story and explained that she wanted the issue of the abused victim to include every victim, Jew and non-Jew alike. I agree with you. I think there's nowhere in the film that suggests that she was Jewish. So she was there. I mean, you might think it by watching it. Oh, this is obviously, and that's why if you read so much of the commentary on the film, they always talk about the Holocaust, or the film features the Holocaust. The film features the Holocaust, but it doesn't really. She herself is not Jewish, so this was not a part of what we call the Holocaust against the Jews. It's not even clear. I mean, she's the daughter of a socialist activist, so it's not clear why the daughter of a socialist would find herself in this. I don't know what it's the camp. It's not clear exactly what kind of a camp this was. Um, uh, because there were obviously prison labor camps, there were death camps. So, but whatever, she was clearly in this camp, um, but yeah, there's no implication at all that she is Jewish, and she's just one of the many victims of the Nazis. So yeah, I think it's an important point. And then Cynthia goes on. So could that also explain why the naked people you see in the film lining up to enter the concentration camp are people of all faiths, not just of the Jewish faith? And since this obviously goes against the prevailing view that nearly all the victims of the Holocaust were Jews, could that also explain why the film was received so many bad reviews by the mainstream press over the years? Um, I haven't really thought about that aspect of it um, the because to be honest, I think most people, most of the critics watching the film, assume that she is Jewish, and that everybody who is being lined up, like that naked uh, and tortured and what are obviously themselves Jews. I think that I think is the prevailing view, and so that was that that sense. So I don't think that aspect would played into the criticism of Cavani, because I think the critics assumed and audiences assumed that she was Jewish, and that all the people who were being shoveled into the naked and to be tormented were Jews. So, but as you said, they weren't, and of course they absolutely were not. I mean, it's like the first people in the camps were not Jews. I mean, there were we know that the first people in the camps were socialists, communists, and trade unionists, and then of course the gypsies, and then of course during the war, I mean the greatest number of people killed were not Jews. There were of course people on the Eastern Front, and most of them were Slavs. Of course, Hitler detested the Slavs almost as much as he detested the Jews. But most of the people who were the victims of the Nazis were absolutely not Jews. But it has become um, the prevailing interpretation of World War II, which is that the only victims of the Nazis were Jews. But I don't think this played a role in why they didn't like, or why critics didn't like this film. Um, well, let me before I go on, let me read Cynthia's next comment. So Cynthia says, Cavani also stated in an interview that she depicted the SS officers in the film as a homosexual cult, and a cult that could potentially crumble under the power of female sexuality, which is why Lucia's dance proved too much for Max, trapping him while his potentially gay comrades remained unmoved. But by Max going straight, or at least becoming bisexual, do you think that could have been another reason why his fellow comrades wanted to kill him? Um, it's a very good question. It's a really challenging one. You know, the issue of why they wanted to kill him remains remains kind of very perplexing aspect of the film. Um, one interesting aspect, in fact, I mean, there are two basic stories that are going on in this film. There's a story of the relationship between Max and Lucia. That they were, um, that Max was her tormentor in the camp during the war, and now they meet 12 years later, and they form a relationship. That in itself is there are real questions about what the relationship, because the relationship that they form now in 1957, has certainly kind of sadomasochistic quality to it, but not only that. I mean, I think he really does love her. I think he says, I love you, and he, um, I think he sees this love as in some ways redeeming him, because he is feeling very guilty about all the things that he had done in the war. So although he still hangs out with these various Nazis, he nonetheless feels guilty about that. That's why he says, "I prefer to, to be in the night, to work in the night, because I just don't like the day. During the day, I feel ashamed of myself." So I think he sees this um, as kind of redeeming quality, that he loves her, and he kind of sacrifices himself for her. I mean, he basically tries to save her, and so I mean, they both kind of um, uh, essentially will themselves to death for one another. So that's, but there are sadomasochistic. I mean, so I wasn't convinced that the relationship that they now form 12 years after the war, it's a sadomasochistic relationship. I didn't see it. I think that they really loved each other. So that's my interpretation. Now there's the other aspect of the story, and I think that's why the film is a little confusing, because I thought these two aspects of the story don't aren't so related to each other. Is these Nazis now? They conduct these mock trials. Now that's very interesting. I mean, why are they conducting mock trials? Because it's supposedly um, the these former Nazis. I mean, they weren't just former Nazis; they're former SS people. Um, they are destroying documents about themselves, and then presumably, if there are any witnesses against them, they will try to kill whatever witnesses um, are are still around. But at the same time, you know, it was by no means the case in 1957 in Austria or in Germany that there was a real ferocious hunt for ex-Nazis or ex-SS guards. I mean, they just basically, both the West German authorities and the Austrian authorities didn't really do very much um, about these old SS guards. So they just kind of left them alone. I mean, they had the big Nuremberg trial, where the top Nazis were, some of them were executed, but some were acquitted, some went to prison for a number of years, and then they had a few individual trials. They had the doctor's trial, they had the trial of the judges, and that was that. And then they really didn't do anything very much. And so if you were a member of the SS, they kind of left you alone, unless your case was particularly egregious and you had committed really some very nasty war crimes. Now, maybe the people here did commit egregious war crimes and they felt very they would have to do something about it. But nothing really happened all these years. Nothing was really going on. I mean, so you're a member of the SS. They just left you alone. So the question is then, why are they doing all this kind of, destroying these documents and having all these meetings, these paranoid meetings, that we have to have a mock trial. I think that they themselves were engaged in a kind of sadomasochistic enterprise, that they enjoyed the thrill of having a mock trial. In other words, they would be put on trial and there would be accusers who would be paraded against them, and this is how they got their thrill. Um, and the Max, played by Dirk Bogart, Max kind of was going along with this and said, "Sure, okay, I'll go along with this. We'll have a mock trial." But then he got fed up with it, and he said, "I don't want to do this. It's stupid." Of course, it's stupid. And I think, as my interpretation of film, this is the act that infuriated his former SS colleagues, that he was no longer willing to play their weird game of holding these mock trials. Because remember, the point about this mock trial was that they would bring witnesses. These former SS characters would bring into the trial actual real witnesses against one of their own. Why would they do this other than some kind of a sadomasochistic need of their own? Because when the SS guy breaks into Max's flat and confronts Lucia, he doesn't kill her. He could easily kill her. I mean, if he felt threatened by her existence, he could have killed her. He doesn't kill her. What does he want from her? He wants her to take part in this mock trial of Max. That's what, because they're getting some kind of a kick out of this. Now, maybe after that, they would kill her. But there was no reason to kill her because, as I said, they weren't really, the Austrian authorities were not really hunting down former members of the SS. The West German authorities weren't really hunting them down. And Lucia, had obviously had no interest in denouncing anybody. She had no interest in going to the authorities to point fingers at former war criminals. She kind of loved Max. So it was her refusal to take part in that mock trial that really infuriated those SS buddies of his. And then when Max says he's not really going to take any further part in this, there's not going to be a mock trial, he then left the job. He left his job at the hotel, which is a kind of a hangout for these SS people. So he left that job and decided to devote himself to this to Lucia because he loved her. I think that's what really infuriated these SS people. I think that they regarded that as a betrayal, that he didn't want to go on playing their little games. Now that's just my interpretation, but I think that so that's it. I don't quite see the sexual aspects of it. To be honest, I think the film was billed as, it's all about sex and it's like, BDSM and bisexuality and whatever. But I didn't really see it that way. I didn't think that the sexual part of it was really that important. I saw it much more as obviously there was the aspect of it, the Stockholm syndrome and so on, but that wouldn't explain why Lucia 12 years later would strike want to strike up a relationship and decides to essentially live her life, live whatever left of her life with Max. I think that's part of the I don't know that I think that they really were in love. This is it's more of a love story. Um, because yes, there is such a thing as a Stockholm uh, syndrome, but that disappears. That doesn't. You're not going to get that. 12 years later. That will have be gone. Um, Now, obviously, she has a death wish, and we can speculate what the basis of the death wish is. He obviously had a death wish. They kind of decided jointly to sacrifice their lives. Um, but I don't know. I guess I didn't quite see the sexual aspects of it as being that important. But I mean, others will have a different interpretation. I'd be very curious to read other people's comments, other people's interpretations, because I didn't quite see it that way. I think it's like if people have this expectation particularly when the film came out. Oh yeah, it's an exploration of Nazis and BDSM and sadomasochists and all sorts of things like that. When you watch it now, I just didn't see it in the film. All right. Anyway, thank you as always, Cynthia. So for everything. And here, Marty, as always, he posts the most hilarious pictures. There's in this picture, Zelensky extends his hand, and and then Orban looks at his hand, almost like I don't know where that hand has been. It looks like you wiped your nose or your backside with that hand of I'm certainly not going to shake it. He's looking at it, with great distaste. Um, I mean, as you know, we did a podcast on this the other day. Ukraine has been hitting the uh, the uh, the Druzhba pipeline, the pumping station of the Druzhba pipeline, which is affecting Hungary's energy supplies. I mean, Hungary gets most of its oil from Russia via the Druzhba pipeline, and so by hitting the pumping station, it's affecting um, Hungary's oil supplies. Hungary's not getting any oil, and Hungary is very annoyed about this. And Zelensky, on the so-called Independence Day on August the 24th, has said, "Well, Hungary hasn't been showing us too much friendship, so we're not going to show Hungary too much friendship." And so, in other words, Zelensky knows full well that what they're doing, that they're hitting the Druzhba pipeline in order to curtail Hungary's oil deliveries. So, um, uh, but it now Hungary has filed its usual complaint to the European Commission, and the European Commission couldn't care less. They don't particularly like Orban. They're happy to see Hungary in trouble. They're happy to see that Hungary is not getting its oil, because that's going to cause problems for the Hungarian economy. And the more problems there are in the Hungarian economy, the more likely it is that Orban will lose next year's election. And then they won't have Orban to worry about subsequently. I mean, that's the theory, which is why Orban's complaints about Ukraine's attacks on the Druzhba pipeline are falling on deaf ears. So I don't know what's it to us. Why should we do anything for Orban? So that's the problem. So even if the Russians repair the this oil pump station, um, Ukraine will probably hit it again. and they know that they can do it at will because Hungary will complain, but the European Commission really couldn't care less about Hungary. The European Commission is taking the side of Ukraine, a non-EU state, and they're taking the side of a non-EU state against an EU state, and that's going to be it. Now. President Trump sent a note last week expressing his sympathies with Orban, but I don't think he's going to get involved in this. I mean, he's got enough problems that he has to deal with Ukraine, with Russia, with the EU, that he's going to get involved in this. So, I think this is going to continue, and then. And each time this happens, I think Hungary is going to complain, and I don't think these complaints are going to do anything. So, but thank you, Marty, for that picture. Anne Marie, always very good to see you. Thank you so much for your generosity. Really appreciate it. Anne Marie is, of course, our resident musical expert, a distinguished musician, has played in the finest orchestras in the world, has worked with some of the leading composers of our time, and so we're always really honored to have her presence and her comments on music on our locals board. And everybody, please read her most recent comments. So she wrote about Mussorgsky's Night on Bald Mountain, which was very interesting. But even more interesting is her recent comments on Till Eulenspiegel's Merry Pranks, and Anne-Marie has played that and describes the difficulty of playing Till Eulenspiegel, and then the difficulties of playing Ein Heldenleben, another Strauss piece. And so it's really, really interesting. Somebody like me who's not a practicing musician, I always find it just fascinating to read comments about what it's like to play very difficult pieces of music. So we're very fortunate to have that experience and knowledge imparted to us. So thank you so much, Anne-Marie. I really appreciate that. And so then Cynthia goes on. I also find it pretty revolting, that a subgenre of sadomasochistic Nazi exploitation, also known as Stalag fiction, flourished in Israel in the 1950s and 60s, and was only banned by the Israeli government because of the Eichmann trial, which took place in 1961. I didn't know that. Because I know that was the genre of the Nazi porn that that became quite fashionable, so to speak, in the 1970s, like Salon Kitty, and there were a number about prisoners of war camps run by Nazis, and I don't know, what was it, Helga the essay? I can't remember the title, but there was they were kind of well-known genre of various Nazis enjoying torturing people. So that was a but they never really got into the whole issue. These Nazi porn films, whether who's Jewish, who's not Jewish. You just had horrible Nazis dressed in Nazi regalia, and then you had their victims who were tortured and, of course, made use of in Nazi-run brothels. So that was it kind of died out, this genre, in the 1980s. Now, I didn't know that it flourished in Israel. That's really interesting. I wonder what happened to those films. I mean, the films must still be around. I wonder if one can find them. I mean, whether there are any titles and because whatever happened to those films. Now, but interesting what you said about the Eichmann trial, because as I say, there was the Nuremberg trials in the number of them, the big one, and then the kind of the smaller trials with the doctors and the judges. Um, and then really nothing. I mean, that all kind of pretty much ended in the late 1940s. And then there was the Eichmann trial in 1961, and that stimulated a new round of trials. Now, this wasn't under Nuremberg anymore, because the Nuremberg was run by this international military tribunal, which was itself run by the four Allied powers. But since the four Allied powers had broken up as a result of the Cold War, the trials that were now taking place were under the auspices of the West German government. So there was no more international military tribunal. So the West German authorities decided they had to do something, because they were kind of, in an embarrassing position. I mean, the Eichmann case kind of put them, in a situation that they had to show that they were doing something. And so that's when they had the Auschwitz trial, and then they also had the Treblinka trial. But in the cases, in both of those trials, they, many of the people were now no longer around. I mean, who knows what happened? Some got killed, some committed suicide, but there weren't that many defendants in either of those cases. And some were not many, but some were sentenced to life in prison. Some were sentenced to prison terms, and then some were acquitted. And relatively lenient, because the ones who were sentenced to prison terms were released, after just a few years, and then they went on to live, quite pleasant, prosperous lives in pleasant, prosperous West Germany. Now, some did die in prison, and then that guy Stangl, I think Stangl. I mean, he may have been the head of Treblinka, or maybe he was number two at Treblinka. I can't remember, but he then cooperated with that author Gita Serenyi, and she wrote a book based on her interviews with Stangl. I think Into the Darkness, I think it was called. And you always have to take everything they say with a pinch of salt, just like Gita Serenyi's book on Albert Speer, which was based on extensive interviews with Speer. They're kind of wily characters. They know how to talk to journalists and so on. So, but the point is that in the early '60s there were these trials, and I think that was triggered by the Eichmann trial in Israel. What I think is interesting and I think striking is that the Germans authorities, the West German authorities, treated these war criminals, these really nasty pieces of work, very, very leniently, very leniently. And quite striking how differently they treated the various Serbs that the Germans put on trial during the 1990s. So they would arrest some Serbs who were really too lowly. The Germans decided they were too lowly to hand over to the ICTY, because the ICTY only wanted to put on trial the big fish, people who had some senior positions within the Serbian and the Bosnian Serbian hierarchy. So since the Germans would arrest some Serb on vacation in Germany, but they were too lowly to interest the ICTY, so they would put them on trial, and they would hit them with 40-year prison terms, for crimes that were infinitesimally smaller than the crimes of the Nazis, whom the German authorities just pretty much gave a pass to. I mean, it was a kind of revolving door when it came to the Nazis. because the Germans decided after the war that, well, they had to rebuild their countries. There was no point in rehashing the past, so they just decided, well, we're going to treat these people. I mean, they had to be really forced into actually conducting these trials, so they forced to conduct the trials. And then when it happens, it finally happens, they dole out some fairly mild sentences, and even then, they go to prison and they don't, in any way even serve out those prison terms. So that's how the Germans dealt with their own. But when it comes to the Serbs, with much, as I say, much milder crimes that they were accused of, the Germans, 40 Jahren, 40 years, or life in prison. Albert Speer was the Nazi armaments minister. I mean, a war criminal by any standard. He got 20 years. I mean, this is the guy. They ran those prisoners of war who were working in his armaments factories under really horrific conditions. Clearly, total violations of international law, the sort of laws on the conduct of war. He got 20 years, and he was supposedly the good Nazi, whatever that meant, because they pretty much told him, you got to go and say at the trial that you're very, very guilty, you're very, very sorry for what you did, you're really, really terribly upset about everything that happened, and then we'll treat you leniently. It's because some of the Nazis didn't really do that. They kind of they just attacked the legality of the Nuremberg process. They said, hey, this is you know this is really unfair. They said, you're making perfectly reasonable arguments. This is the victors putting the vanquished on trial. You committed as many crimes as we did. Why do you get to put us on trial? At the end, why you don't have to in any way face up to your crimes? I mean, a reasonable argument, but of course that didn't impress the judges, and so they was you know, executed. But Speer knew his lines, and Speer said, "Yeah, I'm very, very sorry. Our crimes were monstrous. I was a monster," and so he got 20 years. And when he came out in 1965, he then went on to have quite a very nice, prosperous life in West Germany. And he became a kind of a television pundit. He would come on, whenever there's any discussion about uh, Nazism, Hitler, they'd be on. And, even, I used to, watching it on British television, invariably, you'd see this aging Albert Speer, a very handsome man. Even as he got older, he was still handsome. Even, there he'd be pontificating away. Got himself a nice younger wife, and had a nice life. His last 20 or so years were very comfortable. So that's the sort of the West German, the fat, complacent, smug West Germany that kind of took us all in. I think it took us all in, and now I think we're getting a sense of what this post 1945 Germany is about. But I think for a long time we were kind of taken in by this. By this Germany that seemed really very, very sorry but for everything that it had done. Anyway, um, and then Cynthia goes on, um, and it's even more revolting that this BDSM literature was only ever allowed to be published in the first place because it only depicted non-Jewish male prisoners being masochistic and aroused from sexual abuse by female Nazi guards. If Jewish men were depicted as victims of this, it would be deemed anti Semitic and quickly banned, which is why I wouldn't be surprised at all if Star-like fiction soon reemerges in Israel, with Palestinians being victims of this abuse by the Israelis, of course, and presumably these Palestinians would be enjoying their torture and all the abuse, so that they would really be getting off on this. This is very interesting. I didn't know this. I didn't know that there was a this kind of genre of porn in in Israel. But you say it was banned, that they kind of they banned it, and it's not around anymore. Huh. I mean, I always have I have a doubt. I have my doubts that you can just ban something like this. If there's a market for it, if there's a taste for it, then it will still be around. It might be more difficult to obtain, but it would be around. I mean, if there's, it sounds like this is kind of titillating, and as you say, it's done in the way to make non-Jews to present them in the most unflattering light possible. So that's very interesting. I mean, Cynthia, if you've got um, some references to this, I'd be really interested, because I've never heard of this. And so just one other thing that given we don't have that much time left, but I wanted to talk about this whole thing with this governor of the Federal Reserve, Lisa Cook, whom Trump has fired, but this Lisa Cook is saying, you don't get to fire me, I stay. And of course, the issue with this Lisa Cook was that Bill Pulte, who is the head of the Federal Housing Finance Agency, it's come across. I mean, he's got the records, and he has presented records saying that she has that she had filed 2 mortgage applications, and in 2 mortgage applications, one in Michigan, one in Georgia, they claimed that was her primary residence. And so when you claim something as your primary residence, then you get tax breaks, you get insurance breaks, you get a lower interest rate. So it's mortgage fraud. It's what Tish James, the Big Tish, the Attorney General of New York, is accused of, as is Adam Tish. No, it's not Adam Tish. It's what was this? Adam Schiff, almost like Tish. Adam Schiff also is accused of. Now, but when you said Trump has said, okay, well, you're fired. These are serious accusations. I don't think you have any business being a governor of the Fed while this quite serious investigation is taking place. Now, so she says, no, well, you can't fire me, which is very, very strange, because she gets appointed by a president. And in her case, it was Biden who appointed her to this position. And it's clear, according to the statute, that she can be fired by the president, but it says, well, it has to be for cause. Well, of course, if you fire someone for cause, it all depends on what the what counts as cause. I mean, these are quite serious charges, but of course, the media have now leapt to the defense of, as you might have expected, Lisa Cook, and they're saying, obviously, what Trump's doing is wholly illegal, wholly unconstitutional. You can't go around firing federal governors, even though the statute says, yeah, you can. And of course, she's going to go to the courts, and doubtless she will get an injunction preventing Trump from firing her. and then she will, stay on while Trump, pursues this case in court. Now, it's kind of interesting, though, what Jerome Powell, the chair of the Fed, is going to do about it, because if he kind of just goes along with this and does not carry out the president's wish, and then the court rules, I mean, doubtless there'll be a district court that will say, oh no, she has to stay. But then if the appellate courts, either the circuit courts or maybe the Supreme Court, and presumably will go up to the Supreme Court, because whichever way the circuit court rules, it's going to be appealed to the Supreme Court. But if the Supreme Court rules, as I think they will rule, that that he can fire the a governor, then that might provide a basis for Trump being able to do what he wanted to do for some time, which is to fire Jerome Powell. He says, well, Jerome Powell was clearly not carrying out my wishes. And then you can fire Jerome Powell for cause. So you can't fire Jerome Powell because he refuses to lower interest rates. But if he keeps as a governor someone who is clearly unsuited to be a governor, then I think he can be fired. Now, whenever the subject of the Fed comes up, there's always amazing kind of crap that is peddled by the media, espousing the notion that somehow the Fed is the central bank is sacrosanct. No one must ever touch the Fed. It must remain completely unpolluted, untainted by political concerns, which is kind of strange, because given the enormous impact central banks have on the economy, on inflation, on unemployment, on whether you can buy a house, whatever, given the enormous impact that their decisions have, it's quite extraordinary that the media should espouse the idea that the bankers should not be accountable to anyone. That mere politicians, the people who get voted into office, they should have no say at all, none, in monetary policy. No, absolutely not. It's got to be done by these bankers, these economists. They alone must decide the fate of the economies of their countries, of continents, of the world. It really is a kind of the classic kind of the technocratic elite who must not be in any way disturbed by the mere concerns of politicians. This ridiculous idea is what you get, regularly in the media. So whenever Trump would berate Jerome Powell on that he's keeping interest rates too high, immediately jumped to the rest of the on the side of Powell and said, "Oh my God, how can you possibly put any pressure on Powell? Why should Powell or any central banker? Why should his view prevail over an elected leader?" And given how often, and this is well recorded, how often central banks have actually ousted political leaders. I mean, Liz Truss. Obviously, I'm no fan of Liz Truss. I don't like her, but nonetheless, she was clearly ousted by the Bank of England. Berlusconi in Italy, ousted by the European Central Bank. In one country after another, it was the central bank that decided, well, I think you're gone. So they have a seniority. They're obviously much more important than mere elected politicians. And the media are obviously very satisfied with this. So here's a little sampling of of the coverage of this. Where are we now? Oh, that's not it. Yeah, yes, let's want to get this. Then, yeah, this. Let me find this. So here, for instance, here's Politico, and it says Trump's attack on Fed triggers alarm in Europe over economic stability. So economic stability equals a central bank untroubled by the mere concerns of mortals. They look at numbers and they make decisions which no one knows, no one can understand, and no one has any say on it other than these experts who went to Harvard Business School or Chicago Business School or whatever. They alone must decide what the interest rate should be, whether what the inflation rate should be. So it says European unease is palpable as U.S. president moves to get rid of key federal. She's now a key official. Wow, key. She's a key official. And say Europe, that says the bankers cautiously critical of Trump's efforts to oust the top Federal Reserve official. And talks about Trump invoked sweeping executive powers to unseat Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook in an unprecedented challenge to the legally enshrined independence of the Fed. And then it says that across the Atlantic, Cook's counterparts at the European Central Bank are alarmed. They're alarmed. Bankers are alarmed. Well, if they're alarmed, we all better be alarmed. That Trump's move could not only set a dangerous precedent, but also have a tangible impact on their own policymaking. Oh, they're policymaking. They're involved in policymaking. So why are unelected bankers, all extremely wealthy, who after this stint will go on to make enormous sums of money, why are they involved in policymaking, which is inexorably influenced by the course charted by the Fed? And attacking the independence of the Fed, the Trump administration inflicts a serious damage to the American economy, sends Bank of Greece Governor Yanis Stournaras. And then when independence is threatened, monetary policy becomes dysfunctional. It starts doing things that it shouldn't do. Now, why? But why? You say it's dysfunctional. How functional is the monetary policy as it is? I mean, we've had very high inflation rate. I thought these bankers were supposed to eliminate inflation rate. So we've had very high inflation rate, and so that was, but that's okay. That's presumed fine. Moreover, they essentially, I mean, remember when Jerome Powell once admitted that that the policy of immigration, why America and Europe pursued a policy of uncontrolled immigration, the goal was to tamp down inflation. So that is a central bank. They're supposed to tamp down inflation. So I said, well, yeah, but that's why we have open borders, because with the open borders, you drive down the price of labor, and therefore you deal with inflation. And so anyway, that was European Central Bank Christine Lagarde. The independence is threatened. And then chief among officials' worries is that without independence, the faith on which central bank stewardship of financial markets has been painstakingly built over decades will begin to crumble. I mean, this is political writing. Central bank stewardship of what stewardship? You had crises after crisis. They missed the biggest crisis of our time. First of all, the crisis of the subprime mortgage market, which others had saw was coming. They missed that. Then they missed the big euro banking crisis of 2010 to 2011, but they are stewardship of financial markets, painstakingly built over decades. And it says that would in turn erode central bankers' ability to steer the economy and manage inflation. How are they steering economy? How are they managing inflation at a time when their credibility is already taking a beating? Why is their credibility taking a beating? Amid deep dissatisfaction over management of the economy after the pandemic. Yeah, that's right. They pumped the economy full of cash, and then they've got inflation. What a shock! Anyway, so then it goes on, and then here we have unprecedented. This is the Financial Times. Unprecedented. Donald Trump moves on the Federal Reserve, and president's attempt to fire Governor Lisa Cook risks undermining central banks' independence. In any case, what does the firing of Lisa Cook have anything to do with the central bank's independence? I mean, she's being fired for cause. He says, well, look, I mean, here, he has the documents from Bill Pulte, the Federal Housing Finance Agency head. He says, she basically is guilty of mortgage fraud. So it is firing for cause. But in any case, even if you can, disagree whether she should be fired or whatever, it's still within his prerogative. And it's hard to see how this is attacking the central bank's independence, even if the central bank's independence is a desirable goal. And then Trump's late night putsch. Remember, he has the legal right to fire her. What putsch are we talking about here? Represents one of the gravest challenges to the Fed since it became independent 74 years ago. So if it became independent 74 years ago, then it's not something that's written in stone. It's not something that, Moses came down with and saying the Fed must be independent. So 74 years ago. That's quite recent. And so, but apparently, then that has to be the writ of God. It must be independent. Cook, the first black woman to join the Fed's board of governors, has vowed to fight Trump and remain in office, saying the president had no authority to fire her. Well, she can say that. But Trump's move showed a ruthless determination to seize decision-making at the central bank, even at the cost of the independence that for decades has helped sustain faith in U.S. economic policymaking. There's no faith in U.S. economic policymaking. They're making stuff up. And then it says, this is unprecedented, says a professor at Columbia Law School. If this removal sticks, it spells something close to the end of central bank independence in the U.S. Oh, no. You mean you're going to have banks that are accountable, and therefore what they actually do comes under public scrutiny and therefore under public criticism. Anyway, it goes on, and then here's the New York Times. Seeking to control the Fed, Trump risks upending a pillar of the global economy. You can see it's all cooked in the same kitchen. All these stories are exactly the same. President Trump's attempt to fire Lisa Cook, a Fed governor, will set off a long legal battle. Economists warn it could lead to higher inflation and government borrowing costs. And here we have the Janet Yellen. They're quoting Janet Yellen. One of those incompetent Fed chairs in modern times, who was Mr. Powell's immediate predecessor as Fed chair and later served as Treasury Secretary under President Biden. She said she was utterly alarmed by the move. Well, of course she would be alarmed. I feel this has now turned into an all-out assault on the Federal Reserve and an attempt by President Trump to really gain control over decision-making at the Fed. And then Peter Conti Brown, an expert on Fed governance at the University of Pennsylvania, said Ms. Cook's firing, if successful, would mark the end of central bank independence as we know it, and the end of Western civilization as we know it. You kind of missed that one. And then here's the Washington Post, which at least asks this question: can Trump fire Cook? And here's the answer. Section 10 of the Federal Reserve Act states that members of the Fed board shall hold office for a term of 14 years. Well, that's nice. I think a lot of people would like to have, a guaranteed job for 14 years. But for some reason, she's going to be there till 2038, and she was appointed in 2022. So I guess she takes a 2-year break. So anyway, so she'll be there 2038. In theory, she'll hold term of office 14 years from the expiration of the term of his predecessor, unless sooner removed for cause by the president. Unless sooner removed for cause by the president. But the act does not define what qualifies as cause, which creates a legal gray area. So the Washington Post admits it's a legal gray area. So, but if you read the media, they say, well, of course, Trump has absolutely no right whatsoever to fire her, and of course, this is a threat to the independence of the central bank, which is one of the greatest achievements of Western civilization. Alongside Plato and the rule of law. A 1935 Supreme Court ruling, known as Humphrey's Executor, established the constitutionality of independent agencies overseen by multi-member boards. As a result, presidents can remove Fed governors from independent agencies only if there is cause, generally understood by legal experts to mean malfeasance or some form of dereliction of duty. But this is the first time a president has tried to remove a sitting Fed governor. Okay. And this year, the Supreme Court has issued interim rulings allowing Trump to fire several independent regulators without cause, despite the 1935 precedent, arguing in one unsigned majority order that as the Constitution vests the executive power in the president, he may remove without cause executive officers who exercise that power on his behalf, subject to narrow exceptions recognized by precedents. Cook denies any cause for her dismissal exists and says she intends to continue in her role. And then she says, President Trump purported to fire me for cause when no cause exists under the law, and he has no authority to do so. Well, we'll see whether there's no cause. But he obviously has authority to do so. But whether the courts will agree that is reasonable for cause, well, we'll see about that. I think that they will absolutely think that, yeah, that's for cause. You can't have governors of the central bank being accused of mortgage fraud. And then I will continue to carry out my duties to help the American economy as I have been doing since 2022. And so that's it. Now, the only reason that I'm raising this is I can't take all this sanctimony about the central bank. Why should anyone in his right mind defend central bankers? They haven't done a particularly good job, and they should be held to account. I don't think anybody should just simply, hold a job in perpetuity without, or even 14 years. That's very nice. Get a 14-year appointment, um, without some kind of accountability, and that applies to judges, and applies to central bankers. But it's kind of interesting that the media, that are supposed to be the watchdogs of the people, they're there to make sure that the powers that be are accountable, and that they in some ways act in the interests of the people. There they are, no, don't touch the judges. The judges must be absolutely independent of any kind of political control, even though they're making political decisions all the time. No, don't touch them. Central banks, yes, the central bank should sit there and apparently make these decisions on the basis of what? Well, we don't know. What do they actually do in their offices? They're looking at numbers. What are these numbers that they're making decisions? Oh, we don't want to know. We just have our faith in God we trust. So in Jerome Powell we trust, and that's the credo of the journalists. Anyway, um, I think my time is up, and so thank you very much, everybody who joined me. Thank you very much for all of your really interesting comments, questions, and it's just always so stimulating to be here and to talk to you. And thank you above all to those who looked at the tip jar, saw that he was in a lamentable condition, looked at, thought about the dogs and how upset the dogs will be when they come tomorrow morning to check the tip jar and then take out all their anger on me. So I really appreciate that. And so thank you. And then we will be back, I hope, on Thursday at the same time. I look forward to seeing all of you then. Until then, good night. See you. All the best. Bye bye.